Hey guys, today we step into a sun-bleached morning on the Iranian plateau where the wind rubs sand against the city walls like a cat against your shins and you're parched before breakfast. The air already shimmers, bells from a donkey cart jingle somewhere near the gate, and every courtyard smells faintly of dust, lime plaster and rosewater. You reach for a cup expecting warm water that tastes like the inside of a clay jar, and instead you touch a rim beaded with cold. A thin film of dew kisses your fingers. You take a sip and the chill slides across your tongue like a tiny mountain breeze. The day hasn't even started and somehow the desert has misplaced its heat, at least inside your cup. It's soothing, it's improbable, and if we're honest, you probably won't survive this. Kidding, you'll be fine. But your self-control around sherbat, that's another story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is, your location, and local time, so I can picture your night air, your lamplight, and the way your own glass sweats. You trudge forward through the sleepy lanes of an ancient Persian town, the kind that grew where water decided to pause for breath. Above you, walls rise in sun-baked ochre. Below you, coolness nestles in the ground, tucked into clay and shadow like a secret. People here learned long ago to persuade air and earth to behave. They coaxed breezes down tall wind catchers, badgers that loom like organ pipes. They stitched underground veins, qanats, so water could walk from mountain to town without fainting in the sun. They grew shade where there was none, and they taught heat to mind its manners. Your cup is the quiet proof. The mainstream fact arrives as gently as the morning. For centuries, Persians mastered the art of cooling in a landscape that was otherwise allergic to cold. They built yakhchals, great domed ice houses with walls thick enough to ignore gossip and weather both. They stored winter ice and snow cut from far hills, and in summer they served sherbat. Yes, our word, sherbet and syrup trace back to sherbat, perfumed drinks kissed with rose or sour cherry, sometimes brushed with saffron, sometimes brightened with a squeeze of citrus that arrived along slow caravan lines. You take another sip and your shoulders loosen. Even the wind decides to stop nagging your ears for a moment. A quirky tidbit steals into the shade like a stray cat. Some recipes called for mixing thin grape must or fruit syrups with packed snow, then whisking the mixture back and forth between two bowls to thicken the chill, an arm workout that doubles as dessert. If your biceps are soft, now blame the refrigerator. In markets, vendors praised sherbat with the same sincerity modern baristas reserve for single-origin espresso. Rosewater from Kashan snow from the high pass, please and thank you. You hear a boy whistle as he pedals past, delivering clay beakers wrapped in damp cloth, each vessel sweating politely like a guest who's overdressed. Historians still argue whether the earliest fully developed yakhchals date to the Achaemenid era or matured later under the Parthians and Sassanids. They also debate how much day-to-day cooling relied on imported snow versus nocturnal evaporation in carefully designed pools. You picture a night watchman stepping through starlight, checking shallow water channels outside town, the surface cooling under black velvet skies. By dawn, a thin sheet of ice might be coaxed into existence even when the noon would be merciless. The truth is likely a blend: snow caravans for abundance when roads allowed evaporative magic, when skies were clear and patient. Scholarship can be a gentle tug-of-war, dates shift. Methods overlap and you're lucky you get to drink the consensus. You pause in a pool of shadow where the air feels like cool silk. There's a smell here, mineral and clean, that rides up from the qanat galleries, the underground aqueducts humming softly beneath your sandals. Somewhere a copper ladle taps an amphora neck, ting-ting-ting, announcing a fresh pour. The sound joins the distant bells and the low hush of the windcatchers exhaling. You remember modern life's buzzing appliances and think honestly, the desert's ventilation system has better manners. No hum, no glare, just gravity, geometry and patience. Let's ground the marvel in your grasp. Your cup is likely clay unglazed on the outside to allow slow evaporation. The potter leaves the surface thirsty on purpose. A damp cloth or a splash of water encourages tiny sips of moisture to flee into the dry air, stealing heat. As they go, ancient swamp cooler, no electricity required. If the household is well-to-do, they've stored blocks of winter ice inside a yakhchal, a conical pit below ground, a thick dome above, and a north-facing wall to dodge the sun's stare. The base may hold sand and straw for insulation. The exterior wears a lime mortar that laughs at heat. Inside, the air is so well behaved that ice winters over like a dignified retiree. You imagine stepping into that echoing belly palms on cold grainy walls, breath puffing in miniature clouds. The city outside is all sun. The room you're in is the season that just left. There's a playful aside in the corner even court poets wanted a share of the cool. Verse compares lips to snow cheeks, to pomegranate the beloved, to a sherbat, whose sweetness blurs the afternoon. It's basically the medieval version of posting a first iced coffee of summer selfie, just with better metaphors and no hashtags. Nobles host feasts where chilled drinks arrive under silk canopies, and servants glide through gardens designed like green maps, each path a trick for breeze and shadow. You set your cup down on a stucco bench and run your thumb along the rim. The glaze inside is smooth as pond water, the outside matte as chalk. Simple, elegant, effective, like a joke that lands 3 seconds late and makes you smile anyway. But it isn't only pleasure. Physicians weigh in because of course they do. Some praise cold drinks for balancing the body's heat in temperaments runs hot and dry. Others caution the stomach might sulk if surprised mid-sweat. The advice reads like an ancestor of your favourite health blog. Cold is fine if it's gentle, less fine if you caught the midday sun with your mouth open. You nod, decide a small cup is wise, then take another because self-control is a flexible concept. The wind pushes a line of prayer flags left by someone's door. Their soft tatters flick sand from the air and you hear the tiniest tinkle of a bell like a sip made audible. Your thoughts wander to trade to mules freighted with snow wrapped in straw, to mountain paths where dawn is brisk enough to make you grateful for every layer to caravanserais that pull travellers like pockets of cool speech along the road. Merchants turn cold into a story and stories into profit. Snow from such and such pass, they brag, pure as a saint's bedtime. You look down at the cup and the watery circle left on the bench is a tiny moon. The desert invents tenderness in strange places. You stretch the day, widening your eyelids pleasantly heavy, though you've only sipped sweetness and air. On the city's skyline, windcatchers yawn. In a nearby courtyard, someone wets the porous walls of a jar, coaxing one more degree of kindness from the heat. You think if houses had personalities, these would be polite aunties always offering shade, always whispering, drink something. The sand hushes around your feet, and a long, lazy breeze drifts the smell of mint from a kitchen. Now you're ready to move. Ahead lies the bazaar, its spine cooled by shadows and thick awnings, where sherbat sellers trade in small miracles and casual bragging rights. You'll taste pomegranate and rose, maybe sour orange, maybe tamarind, each one poured with a practiced wrist, each one a sip of mountain memory smuggled into noon. The bells are closer now, the sand softer beneath your steps, and the city breathes with you, slow in slow, out like a lullaby with good acoustics. But the next duty was even stranger. In the bazaar's heart, an ordinary stall hid a trick for keeping cups frosted through the hottest hour. You drift now into the bazaar, its spine stretching under long rows of patched awnings, each one tugged by the desert wind until it hums like a sail. The ground crunches with grit, the air smells of dust and cardamom, and you follow a trail of laughter that leaks from a sherbat stall like steam from a teapot. Here, amid baskets of figs and copper pans stacked in precarious towers, vendors guard a secret how to keep drinks frosted, even when the noon sun scowls like a disapproving uncle. You lean on a wooden counter that's sticky with spilled syrup, and a boy hands you a cup so cold your palm aches pleasantly, as if you've just reached into a stream high in the mountains. The mainstream fact is simple but dazzling. Persians often kept cooled drinks right here in the markets, by using underground storage pits linked to qanats, or small cellars lined with ice cut from winter mountains. Some stalls even had shallow basins where water spread in thin sheets overnight, frosting into delicate ice that could be shaved off at dawn. By noon, customers bought syrup poured over those chips, sweet and refreshing, a miracle packaged into everyday commerce. And now for the quirky tidbit, sherbat sellers sometimes advertised their icy goods with literal bells ringing small chimes to lure thirsty shoppers. Imagine a hot afternoon, you trudging past donkey carts, and somewhere between the smell of roasting lamb fat and the jangle of scales weighing saffron, you hear a tinkling bell. Not prayer, not a caravan, just the cheerful announcement. Cold drinks here, colder than your in-laws' welcome. The sound carries better than any neon sign could. But of course historians argue. Some insist that widespread bazaar ice only became reliable during certain dynasties when yakhchals multiplied, and snow caravans were more frequent. Others believe the common folk improvise daily with porous jars, cloths and breezes, reserving actual ice for wealthier households. The debate matters because it reveals how much of this luxury trickled down. Was every tired traveller really sipping snow in July? Or was most of the population just savouring cool water from clay jars with true sherbat ice, as rare as a winning lottery ticket? You'll never get a clean answer though, your taste buds don't seem to care. The stallkeeper raises his eyebrows as you take another sip. He's proud of his family recipe rosewater syrup thickened with honey, laced with mint leaves that cling to the ice like green boats on a frozen lake. He cracks a joke about how his sherbat lasts longer than a camel's patience, and customers chuckle knowingly. You lick a stray drop from your wrist and think, yes, humour tastes better chilled. The sensory anchors pile in, a breeze sneaks under the awning and flutters strips of cloth tied like makeshift flags. Copper bells clink against each other with lazy insistence. The air is a patchwork of sweetness, sweat, and saffron dust. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the bazaar's hum sink into your chest like the world's most complex lullaby. But the soft cliffhanger tugs at your sleeve. Not every refreshment was meant for the crowd. Beyond these stalls, behind guarded walls, lay underground chill chambers, where silence did the real work. You slip away from the bazaar's chatter, following a narrow lane where the noise of bells and haggling fades into something quieter, like a drumbeat muffled by sand. The alley curls toward a low arch in the wall, half hidden by thorny shrubs, and the kind of doorway you'd miss if you weren't thirsty. A guard sits there wiping sweat with the back of his sleeve, and when he moves aside you duck into the cool breath of darkness. This is no ordinary cellar. You're descending into the belly of a yakhchal, the great ice house of Persia, where underground chill chambers preserve the winter inside summer's ribs. Your sandals scrape on packed clay steps, the light behind you shrinks to a thin coin, and suddenly the air changes dry crisp, shockingly cool. You breathe in, and it feels like mint without the mint. The floor is wide and echoes faintly, the walls slant upward into a dome so thick you imagine even the sun pounding its fist can't get through. You shiver, and it isn't from fear. The mainstream fact these yakhchals were feats of engineering, some dating back over 2 millennia. The Persians carved conical pits beneath ground level, sometimes as deep as 6 meters, then capped them with domes as high as a house. The walls, made of sarouj, a mixture of clay sand, lime egg whites, goat hair and ash, were nearly 2 meters thick, insulating better than modern coolers. In winter, blocks of ice harvested from rivers or shallow freezing pools were stored here, layered with straw for separation. By summer, the stockpile endured, allowing chilled drinks, preserved foods, and even medical applications to exist in a landscape otherwise allergic to frost. But here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes people also use these chambers as quiet meeting spots, the kind of place where politics and whispers mingled with the breath of cold air. Imagine 2 merchants crouched beside a block of ice, plotting prices, their words puffing little clouds like dragons in candlelight. And believe it or not, stories claim that mischievous kids would sneak in to lick the edges of the ice blocks. It's humanity's earliest snow cone theft minus the flavoured syrup. Historians still argue whether the genius of the yakhchal was uniquely Persian, or whether similar storage pits existed elsewhere and were refined here. Some point to Babylonian or Median precedents, while others argue that the perfected dome design with evaporative cooling flues was distinctly Persian innovation. Scholarly debates stretch across journals like long lazy shadows, with footnotes jousting over technical details of airflow. You shrug-sip your imaginary sherbat and think arguing about ice in the desert is strangely poetic. The chamber wraps you in a stillness that feels more like mountain air than city. The wind outside is a faint memory, the bazaar's bells reduced to ghosts. You trail your fingers along the wall, cool grit sticks to your skin, and somewhere water drips into a hidden channel. The sound is rhythmic, hypnotic, like a clock with no urgency. For a moment you forget where you are. Time here is refrigerated too. Your host gestures to a block of ice packed in straw. He chips a corner with a small chisel, drops the shard into a copper cup, and hands it to you. The ice hisses faintly as it meets sweet syrup, a whisper of mountain snow surrendering to pomegranate. You take a sip and the taste is sharp, bright, ridiculously alive against the desert's dull throb. You almost laugh, it's absurd to be this refreshed underground in July. A little joke slips in, you realise that essentially you're standing in the desert equivalent of a walk-in freezer. Except this one doesn't have a humming compressor or fluorescent lighting. Just silence, patience, and really good masonry. If there were health inspectors back then, they'd probably faint at the straw insulation, but hey, the system worked. You lean against a straw bale, drowsy lulled by the chill and the faint drip, drip, drip. Your eyes grow heavy, but the guide taps your shoulder gently. He whispers that not all duties connected to ice were this peaceful. Some involved long nights, lonely torches, and a peculiar watchman's job you've never considered before. You climb back into the night, though not to sleep. Instead, you join the company of a man whose job it is to make sure the ice does not vanish before sunrise. He is the night watchman of the ice, a figure who seems absurd and poetic at the same time. Imagine clocking into work not at a factory, not at a market stall, but in front of a dome-shaped yakhchal with a spear, a lantern, and the desert's chill gnawing at your beard. You are literally guarding frozen water. Some people pull graveyard shifts in offices. This man pulls it over blocks of snow wrapped in straw. The mainstream fact ice once harvested or coaxed from shallow pools was precious. So precious in fact that entire night crews were assigned to protect it from thieves' animals and the desert air. At night, when the pools outside the city froze, workers would carefully scrape and carry the thin sheets into pits. The watchman's duty was to patrol to ensure no one walked off with the prize and to keep fires far away. In some records, towns appointed officials responsible for rationing and securing this cold wealth. Ice wasn't just refreshment, it was currency of comfort, status, and survival. A quirky tidbit, some tales suggest children or desperate neighbours sometimes crept up at night trying to pry a shard of ice to suck like candy. The watchman would chase them off with a stick or toss pebbles into the dark. There's even a story of a fox sneaking into a yakhchal, licking the edges until its whiskers frosted white. You can almost see the poor watchman explaining to his boss, "Yes, sir, a fox stole the ice. Try filing that report." But historians still argue how common these duties were. Did every town have formal ice guards? Or was it more of an ad hoc arrangement, a nephew or servant drafted to keep an eye on things? Some scholars argue that only royal or elite ice houses had round-the-clock care, while rural communities left the pits covered and trusted the desert's dryness to do the work. The debate lingers like a torch flickering in the night, not enough evidence, only scattered mentions and lots of imagination to fill the shadows. You lean against a mud-brick wall with the watchman lantern swaying in your hand. The desert at night is not silent, never silent. The wind sighs along the alley like a flute. A bell tied to a distant donkey jingles faintly. Somewhere water seeps through a qanat, a liquid heartbeat beneath your feet. You close your eyes, hearing the drip echo in your mind until it feels like your own pulse. The torchlight flickers gold against the pale dome of the yakhchal. You breathe, and your breath itself smokes like incense. The watchman sighs and mutters a complaint he'd rather be sleeping on his mat with his children curled nearby. But ice doesn't watch itself. He taps the dome proud despite the boredom and says, "This is wealth, frozen rain, stored summer happiness." You realise his shift is essentially ancient night security for popsicles, which makes you chuckle under your breath. The man doesn't laugh. He's heard every joke before. Your own eyelids droop, the desert air cooler here, the lantern swaying like a metronome. You could sleep standing up, lulled by the combination of quiet and cold. Yet just before you drift off, the watchman whispers something else. Not all ice came from these shallow freezing pools. Some of it travelled hundreds of miles tied to the backs of camels and mules wrapped in a straw, and dreams of profit. And those caravans brought their own stories, stranger still. You follow that whisper, and suddenly the silence of the watchman's corner gives way to the deep, trudging rhythm of hooves. The sound rises from the desert floor like a heartbeat too slow to keep pace with the stars. You're no longer leaning against a yakhchal wall, you're walking beside a caravan, a crooked line of camels stretching like beads across the moonlit horizon. Each beast is loaded not with spices or bolts of silk, but with the strangest cargo imaginable in the middle of the desert straw-wrapped bundles of snow and ice. The mainstream fact is arresting in certain dynasties. Persian rulers and wealthy merchants organized the transport of snow from high mountains down into cities where heat ruled the day. Caravans hauled ice packed in straw and animal hides over dozens or even hundreds of miles. These journeys were no joke. Snow had to survive blazing sun and sandstorms, and the timing was critical. Delivered too late, the cargo melted into expensive puddles. Delivered on time, it became a luxury for the nobility and a marvel to common eyes. A quirky tidbit shuffles into view with a jingling bell. Some sources say that on especially hot days, chunks of this snow were thrown into fountains at palaces, instantly cooling the courtyards and delighting guests. Imagine being invited to a royal banquet and watching ice cubes, literal mountain memories, tumble into a marble basin, while musicians strummed nearby. One chronicler even suggests that serving drinks cooled with mountain snow was a way to prove both wealth and political dominance. Nothing says I'm in charge quite like importing a glacier into July, yet historians still argue how widespread and practical this caravan system was. Some claim these icy journeys were occasional spectacles recorded precisely because they were unusual. Others believe there was a more regular trade sustained by clever packing methods and sheer determination. Did entire markets depend on snow caravans, or were they mostly for court theatrics? The debate flickers like torchlight on camel saddles, leaving you uncertain but entertained. You trudge beside one camel, its breath fogging faintly in the cool night air. The animal groans like it's reading poetry badly, and you pat its flank as if to reassure it. Yes, carrying frozen water in a desert is just as weird as it feels. The driver ahead mutters a prayer, adjusting the straw bundles, making sure no ice slips free. Each crunch of your sandals presses into sand already printed with hundreds of tired hoof marks. The stars above watch silently blinking like they've seen this before, which they have. Sensory anchors surround you. The wind hisses low across dunes. The straw creaks against the shifting weight of the ice. A donkey bell clinks unevenly, sometimes fading, sometimes sharp. Every so often a guard hums a tune under his breath, a lullaby meant for himself more than for the camels. The desert is a concert, minimal and hypnotic. You feel yourself swaying with the rhythm like a passenger rocked in a cradle. There's humour here too, though subtle. One driver grumbles that by the time they reach the city he could have just poured water into a jar and waited for it to evaporatively cool. Another swears that carrying snow is a waste because if the gods wanted you to drink ice they'd have put glaciers in your backyard. You think about your modern freezer, how you kick it closed with your foot without ceremony, and realise you're spoiled beyond measure. These men are wrestling with the impossible, and you get ice cubes at the push of a button. You rest your head against a camel's load for a moment, and to your surprise the straw feels faintly cold. The chill seeps through your cheek like a secret handshake between mountain and desert. Your eyelids flutter. The world narrows to the sound of bells and hooves until it feels like you're being lulled into the slowest, most monotonous lullaby ever performed. But as the caravan plods on, a stronger scent begins to drift toward you, not straw, not camel, but rosewater and sugar carried on the wind. The promise isn't merely about keeping ice frozen. It's about what comes next, the art of turning that stubborn coldness into shimmering sherbat recipes that taste like liquid poetry. The caravan finally lumbers into the city, its camels groaning in relief as the straw-wrapped ice is unloaded into dark courtyards. You slip through a lattice gate and step into a kitchen that smells like an orchard, in bloom, crushed pomegranate, candied quince, and a delicate whisper of rosewater that clings to the air like perfume on silk. The servants here are not merely cooks, they are artisans, chemists, and comedians rolled into one. Their duty is to transform stubborn lumps of mountain ice into sherbat, a drink so simple and yet so decadent that entire poems have been written about its shimmer. The mainstream fact, Persian sherbat or sharbat, was a celebrated tradition for centuries, mixing fruit syrups, flour distillates, or honey with cold water or ice. Recipes varied wildly: rosewater and sugar for elegant sour cherry, for tart refreshment pomegranate, for deep crimson luxury, or even saffron for golden extravagance. These drinks weren't just cooling. They were woven into social life, offered at banquets, religious gatherings, and the humdrum of everyday hospitality. When you visited a friend's home, sherbat wasn't optional, it was the polite cup of tea before tea itself became popular. The quirky tidbit arrives in a swirl of sweetness. Some sherbat recipes called for ingredients like basil seeds, which swell into slippery gelatinous pearls when soaked in water. They looked a bit like tiny frog eggs, and yet people adored the texture. Children slurped them up while elders swore the seeds cooled the body's hot temperament. You imagine yourself peering into a glass watching these floating pearls bob like jellyfish under a thin crust of shaved ice, and you can't decide whether to sit politely or giggle first. Historians, of course, can't resist poking the sherbat bowl. They debate when exactly sherbat began to incorporate imported sugar instead of honey or grape syrup. Some argue the taste of true sherbat only blossomed after sugar production spread widely through Persia in the medieval era. Others counter that the essence of sherbat, the floral syrups, the ritual of cooling, long predates refined sugar. It's one of those arguments that reminds you academics are basically professional nitpickers, except with fancier footnotes. A servant hands you a tall glass and the first sip is shocking. Icy rosewater slides across your tongue, chased by the faint sting of a lemon. Your teeth chatter, not from cold, but from delight, and you laugh under your breath. The kitchen boys chuckle with you. One jokes that sherbat is basically the iced latte of its time, but with fewer hipsters and more donkeys. Another swears his grandmother still makes the best version, and no amount of royal patronage could match her hand. You think of your own fridge where drinks wait without drama, and realise these men are improvising miracles nightly. The sensory anchors spin around you, copper ladles clinking against jars, a thin trickle of water running into a basin, a small bell jingling as someone bumps the doorway. The air itself is layered sweet syrup, sharp citrus, damp straw from the ice bundles. You lean against a wooden pillar, dizzy with smells and sounds, and you realise this isn't just refreshment, it's a performance. And that performance scales upward. Because beyond these kitchens in silken pavilions where kings lounge under painted ceilings, sherbat becomes something else entirely, a political statement, a show of wealth, a way to cool not just the body, but the perception of power. Your next step will take you there into the halls where sherbat flows like a promise, and where every sip is meant to impress more than to soothe. You drift now from the bustle of the kitchen into a courtyard paved in pale marble, and before you know it, silk curtains part like waves, ushering you into the world of royal sherbat. The air is perfumed with sandalwood smoke, peacock feathers, fans slowly in the corners, and a dozen servants hover around with trays so heavy they look like oversized coins balanced on fingertips. You humble visitor are suddenly seated in a space where sherbat is not merely a drink, it's the performance of luxury itself. The mainstream fact here is dazzling in Persian courts. Sherbat wasn't just refreshment, it was the jewel of hospitality. Kings and shahs hosted elaborate banquets, where guests were handed crystal or ceramic cups, filled with drinks cooled by mountain ice. These weren't casual affairs. Sherbat recipes were chosen to reflect the wealth and prestige of the host. Rosewater sherbat hinted at refinement saffron. Sherbat screamed extravagance, while pomegranate and sour cherry added richness that mirrored the empire's orchards. At times, sherbat was even tinted gold with saffron threads floating like sunlight in the glass. Imagine sipping wealth itself, sweet cold and slightly smug. A quirky tidbit arrives with a flourish. Some accounts claim that sherbat was served in miniature fountains at festivals. Yes, literal fountains that spouted sweetened water over shaved ice, so guests could dip cups and scoop it up like children at a carnival. Picture noblemen bending awkwardly to catch icy rosewater in gilded goblets, trying not to splash their silk sleeves. It's the medieval version of a soda machine, except the soda machine is a marble basin, with poetry carved on the rim. Naturally, historians wrangle over the exact scale of these spectacles. Some insist they were rare and theatrical, reserved for Nowruz or royal weddings. Others believe court sherbat consumption was steady, woven into everyday palace routine. Was the ice really abundant enough to fuel fountains all summer long? Or were those descriptions exaggerated scribes painting pictures with words to flatter their patrons? The debate endures like the aftertaste of too much sugar, pleasant, but impossible to ignore. You glance around the hall and notice the servants themselves whispering jokes. One mutters that the noble's sherbat is so sweet it could glue your teeth shut. Another rolls his eyes at the poetry recitals happening at the far end of the hall. You chuckle with them, quietly realizing that while the courtiers sip with delicate precision, the servants are just hoping no one spills on the expensive rugs. The sensory anchors lull you deeper, the muffled splash of a fountain, the jingling anklets of dancers who drift between tables, the faint tinkle of glass cups being set down. Incense curls through the air like lazy handwriting, and somewhere outside the wind presses gently against the lattice screens, reminding you the desert is still there waiting. You take a slow sip, and the sherbet here is unlike anything you've had. It's layered first sweet rose, then a kick of lime, and finally a shadow of saffron that lingers like a secret. It's the kind of drink that convinces you empires can be built on sugar ice and showing off. But the story doesn't end here, because not everyone had silk pavilions or golden goblets. Beyond these palace walls, common folk still needed refreshment, and their methods of cooling drinks were clever, thrifty, and honestly sometimes funnier than the royal show. And so you leave the echo of fountains behind, stepping into the humbler courtyards, where clay jars sweat in the heat, proving that luxury has a simpler cousin. You step out of the palace halls with their gilded sherbet fountains and silken theatrics, and the sound of flutes fades behind you. The marble coolness slips away, replaced by the earthy hush of mud brick alleys. Here in the common neighbourhood, sherbat is not a stage performance. It is a daily improvisation stitched together with clay cloth and the desert's patience. The mainstream fact ordinary Persians had no royal ice caravans or marble fountains, but they still managed to keep their drinks pleasantly cool. The trick was in porous clay jars known as mashrabs, or mashk left unglazed on the outside so that water could slowly seep and evaporate. This evaporation pulled heat away, leaving the water inside cooler than the blazing air around it. Families often wrapped jars in damp cloth, set them in shaded courtyards, and let the breeze do the rest. It wasn't ice-cold sherbat, but in a land where summer heat presses like an extra cloak, that gentle coolness was enough to feel miraculous. Your quirky tidbit arrives like a neighbour leaning over the wall. Some families hung small goatskin bags filled with water in the draughty alleys. Passers-by could stop, tilt the bag and sip. It was basically a medieval water cooler station minus the awkward office gossip. A traveller could quench thirst and continue the road refreshed not by wealth, but by clever use of air and skin. Some even flavoured their cool water with a sprig of mint or a dash of vinegar for tang as vinegar. Apparently in the right measure it made the water sharper and strangely refreshing. Don't knock it until you've trudged 12 miles in sandals. Naturally historians quarrel a little here too. Some argue that clay jar cooling could reduce water temperature by several degrees enough to feel refreshing in the desert. Others remain sceptical, insisting that without actual ice the effect was minor at best. Yet anyone who has cupped a sweating clay jug on a hot day will tell you scholars can debate all they like, but the human tongue is its own judge. You sit down on a low bench in a dusty courtyard. A boy hauls over a jar twice his size, setting it beside you with a proud grin. He dips a ladle in, and the water that splashes into your cup is faintly cool, no ice crystals here, but enough to make your throat sigh in relief. You close your eyes, sip slowly, and hear the distant tinkling of bells tied to goats, the soft hush of fabric drying on a line, and the whisper of wind pushing grains of sand along the wall. There's humour in this simplicity. One old man jokes that clay jars are better than kings because they keep serving cool water long after rulers have grown hot-headed. Another says his wife refuses to drink palace sherbat too sweet, preferring the taste of the honest clay water. You grin, imagining someone turning down a golden goblet just to drink from a humble jug. That's devotion to terracotta. And here too, cooling drinks could carry meaning beyond refreshment. Families placed clay jugs outside their doors for strangers, a gesture of hospitality that still echoes in Iranian villages today. Imagine walking past throat dry and seeing a sweating jar set out for you unguarded. You tilt the ladle sip and carry on. No fanfare, no saffron, no politics, just kindness distilled in clay and water. But even in these humble lanes, one question lurked: where did the practice truly begin? Who first thought of bending the desert's stubborn air into a servant scholar's trace? The idea back through centuries, through cultures, and they can't quite agree on who to thank. And so your steps carry you not only through alleys of clay jars, but toward the quieter corners of history, where invention and debate meet. You drift along those humble alleys, still cradling the cool taste of clay jar water in your mouth, when the question sneaks in like a sand grain under your sandal strap: who started all this? Who first thought, yes, let's bully the desert into giving us ice? You pause under a cracked archway, listening to the faint rattle of a donkey bell, and realize that this is not just about drinking, it's about credit. And in history, credit is as slippery as melting snow. The mainstream fact is clear enough. Persia is famous for its yakhchals and wind catchers, ingenious methods that predate many other cooling technologies. But the world is messy. Ancient Egyptians cooled their water in porous jars along the Nile. Greeks and Romans stored snow in pits, sometimes covering amphorae with straw. Even in India, records describe early ice production by letting water freeze overnight in shallow earthen pans. So when we ask who invented the cool drink in the desert, the answer isn't neat. It's a chorus of voices spread across empires, each humming its own tune of survival. The quirky tidbit here comes from a traveller's tale. Some classical writers claim that Alexander the Great demanded snow be brought from mountains to chill his wine during campaigns in Persia. Was this luxury bravado, or just his way of saying conquest makes me thirsty? One wonders how many poor soldiers trudged with sacks of melting snow grumbling, while their commander sipped a frosty cup under a tent. It's the sort of detail that makes you laugh softly into your sleeve history's version of the boss stealing the only fan in the office. But historians argue heatedly about this lineage. Did Persia invent the domed yakhchal independently, or were they borrowing and perfecting ideas seen elsewhere? Some point to earlier Mesopotamian storage pits. Others insist the Persian design with its ventilation shafts and insulation was a leap forward, not a hand-me-down. The debate is ongoing footnotes piling up like snowflakes that refuse to melt. You sip your imagined sherbat and shrug. Sometimes it's better just to enjoy the drink than to argue about who poured the first glass. The sensory anchors tighten around you. Wind whines softly through the alley, tugging at loose shutters. Somewhere a bell tolls from a caravanserai tower, a slow clang that echoes like a heartbeat across the night. The air smells of dust smoke and faint mint from a jug someone left out by their door. You trail your fingers along the wall and feel how cool the bricks stay in the shadow. It's as if the city itself participates in this argument, every wall, a different technique, every jar, a tiny laboratory. A neighbour leans out chuckling and says in a voice thick with sarcasm, "Who cares who started it? If it keeps me from sweating through my shirt, I'll give the credit to my donkey." You smile at the joke, but it's also true. The ingenuity of cooling is less about empire pride and more about a universal desire not to roast alive. Sometimes history is simply the long tale of humanity craving comfort. Still, curiosity pushes you deeper. If the origins remain disputed, perhaps the best way to understand is to look closer, not at abstractions, but at the raw architecture itself. The dome, the pit, the stone-thick walls of the yakhchal, these marvels deserve your attention. You turn toward the outskirts of town where the domes rise like clay mountains against the horizon, promising a lesson in engineering that feels both ancient and oddly futuristic. You leave the arguments behind and head toward the edge of the city where the silhouette of a yakhchal rises like a clay mountain under the sun. It looks almost otherworldly, part beehive, part inverted funnel, part monument to stubbornness. As you trudge closer, the wind hisses against your ears, tugging your robe like a bored child. You place your hand on the wall and feel its coarse, grainy surface warm outside but hiding coldness deep within. It's as if the structure itself is telling you, ignore my skin, the real secret lies in my bones. The mainstream fact, the architecture of yakhchals was nothing short of genius. Their walls could be up to 2 meters thick, made of sarouj, a special mortar of clay, sand lime ash, goat hair, and even egg whites. This mix was waterproof, fireproof, and a better insulator than many modern materials. The domed shape funneled hot air upward, while underground pits stored ice, in layers insulated by straw. Some yakhchals had ventilation shafts designed to catch prevailing winds and draw warm air out, functioning almost like ancient refrigerators. These structures were so effective that ice harvested in January could still be served in July, without electricity, without machinery, just earth and physics shaking hands. Your quirky tidbit. Some of these ice houses doubled as status symbols. Towns competed for the largest or most efficient yakhchal, almost like bragging about who had the best sports arena. A particularly impressive dome might get its own nickname woven into local poetry. And yes, there were jokes too. One Persian proverb poked fun at lazy builders, saying their yakhchal leaked more than a drunkard's jug. Imagine being roasted by architecture. Naturally, historians argue over how advanced the airflow systems really were. Some claim the domes were passive marvels designed so perfectly that hot air simply fled upward and left the ice alone. Others suggest we overestimate their sophistication, projecting modern ideas onto what might have been simpler, clay mounds with good insulation. The debate rests on fragmentary evidence, collapsed ruins, traveller notes, and the occasional romantic exaggeration. You can almost hear the scholars bickering like rival masons about whose wall is straighter. You step inside, ducking under the dome. Instantly the air shifts. It's cooler, stiller, carrying the faint smell of straw and damp clay. Your sandals crunch on the packed earth, and the hollow echo makes you feel tiny. You imagine being here at night with only a torch and the sound of water dripping into the pit. The dome looms above, swallowing light, and the silence is so thick you could fold it into a pillow. A mason working nearby wipes his brow and jokes that yakhchals are the only buildings that sweat less than their owners. You chuckle, running your palm over the thick wall. It's warm outside, cool inside, and you realize you're standing in a desert paradox, a building designed not to keep you out but to keep winter in. The sensory anchors drift into your ears, the moaning wind outside pressing against the dome, the faint scrape of straw, as someone shifts a block of ice, the slow trickle of sand sifting from a crack above. Each sound is amplified, hushed, as though the building itself is practicing ASMR centuries before microphones. You linger in the cool chamber, lulled by the strange harmony of heat and cold history and survival. But as you close your eyes, your guide tugs your sleeve. He reminds you that the building isn't the whole story. What about the people who lived here, who worked the long nights around it, who gave their lives to tending ice as if it were livestock? Their stories, quieter than domes, wait for you in the shadows, like the tale of a night watchman whose duty was stranger, lonelier, and more poetic than most jobs history ever invented. The dome still hums behind you, a mute giant of clay and straw, but your guide leads you further into the city's veins. Here, narrow lanes open into courtyards where shadows hold stories. Tonight, you aren't welcome to banquets or bazaars. You're pressed into the shoes of another figure entirely, the ice keeper. A man whose job is less about sipping sherbat and more about wrestling with the desert's stubborn personality. The mainstream fact tending the yakhchal was not just construction, it was ongoing labour. Ice had to be harvested in winter from shallow freezing pools hauled in blocks and carefully stacked inside with layers of straw. During the blazing months, keepers checked for leaks, cleared drainage, and rationed out chunks for market's nobility or apothecaries. A yakhchal wasn't a passive fridge. It was a living system requiring human patience. If the watchmen guarded the outside, the keepers tended the inside, ensuring the ice lasted as long as possible. And then comes the quirky tidbit: some keepers actually used the yakhchal as a social club of sorts. On hot afternoons, they'd slip inside with friends, sit on straw bales and drink cool water, while playing games or reciting poetry. Imagine a medieval man cave, but literally a cold cave where the price of admission was hauling ice. The echoes inside turned every joke into opera, every whisper into performance. If you've ever tried singing in a shower stall, imagine the joy of testing your voice in a chilly dome designed by geniuses. Historians still argue about the scale of these roles. Some say ice keepers were employed directly by city councils or governors trusted like treasurers. Others suggest it was more local, with families taking shifts, each responsible for a share of the labour. The evidence is slim, but the debate is lively. Scholars pointing to taxation records, travellers' notes, or odd references in poetry. The truth probably sat somewhere in between official oversight, but plenty of everyday improvisation. You smile, thinking that even in ancient Persia no one liked unpaid overtime. You settle onto a bale of straw, leaning back against a wall that sighs with coolness. The chamber smells faintly of damp reed smoke from the watchman's lantern, and a touch of mint that someone has tucked into a jug. Your ears catch the steady drip of condensation, the muffled shuffle of sandals above, and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. The world up there is fire. Down here it's ice and sleep. Your host, the ice keeper, mutters about his duties. He has to make sure no one sneaks in to steal more than their share, because ice is wealth, and wealth invites mischief. He chuckles, recalling the time a neighbour pretended his daughter was ill, just to claim a bigger block for medical treatment. You laugh softly with him, thinking it's not so different from people today hoarding medicine or toilet paper for reasons that aren't entirely noble. A softer humour lingers in the corners. Some families treated their ice ration like fine jewellery, displaying it briefly at dinner before hurriedly dropping it into sherbat. Others rushed to show guests a cube just to prove their connections. Look, actual snow in July, they'd boast as if the flake were a crown jewel. If Instagram had existed, every Persian noble would have posted their sherbat glass with the caption, "Blessed, just chilled life." You stretch listening as the ice keeper stirs straw around the blocks with a long pole. The sound is scratchy, almost like sandpaper, yet rhythmic, soothing, hypnotic. You could doze right here, lulled by the contrast of cool breath and hot memory. But before your eyes close, he shakes his head. "Festivals," he mutters. "Wait until you see what they do with this ice when the drums come out." His voice holds both pride and exasperation. Festivals meant work, meant extravagance, meant sherbat poured in ways so theatrical even the most stubborn desert wind paused to watch. You follow the ice keeper's muttering toward a square that is no longer quiet. The hush of straw and dripping water fades, replaced by the steady thrum of festival drums, the shouts of hawkers, and the perfume of roasting lamb fat swirling in the air. Tonight the city has decided to celebrate, and with it to show off its most peculiar treasure. Not jewels, not gold, but sherbat fountains splashing in the middle of the desert. The mainstream fact during certain festivals, particularly Nowruz, the Persian New Year ice, and Sherbat, played starring roles. Chilled drinks were poured into great stone basins or even marble fountains, and streams of flavoured water trickled for guests to dip their cups. These were moments of civic pride where the ingenuity of the yakhchals and the wealth of the rulers were displayed in the liquid form. Imagine standing under the sun, sweat dripping, and then seeing rosewater sherbat bubbling from a carved lion's mouth. You'd believe in miracles on the spot. And here's the quirky tidbit: children sometimes treated these festivals as free-for-alls, darting forward with clay mugs or even bare hands, scooping sherbat as though it were a carnival ride. Adults pretended to be outraged, but most joined in, and the sherbat sellers would roll their eyes, half annoyed, half amused. Records even hint that sherbat vendors at festivals occasionally spiked their syrups with unexpected flavours like vinegar saffron, or even cucumber to surprise customers. Think of it as the medieval version of an experimental soda machine. Press here for mystery flavour was alive and well. Of course, historians wrestle with the scale. Were sherbat fountains common or rare spectacles exaggerated in poetry? Some scholars insist they were reserved for royal celebrations carefully staged for propaganda. Others argue they were widespread part of the communal joy of the holiday, with towns across Persia replicating the practice in miniature. Without photographs, we're left with verses and chroniclers, each more eager than the last, to prove that his city's festival was the coolest, literally. You lean against a stone column, eyes half-lidded as the festival swells around you. The sensory anchors tumble one after another, the throb of a drum echoing off mud-brick walls, the clang of cymbals like metal birds colliding in the sky, the tinkling laughter of children slurping sherbat too fast. A donkey bell jingles in the distance, half swallowed by music, and weaving through it all is the smell of rosewater, sweet and heady like perfume poured straight into the night air. A jester flips a ladle into the fountain, catches it behind his back and winks at you. Someone in the crowd mutters that sherbat here is colder than a miser's smile, and another bursts out laughing. You grin too, letting the absurdity wash over you. In the desert, people are literally playing with ice water. It's like juggling snowballs in a sauna, ridiculous and yet irresistible. You sip from a clay cup cold syrup dribbling down your wrist and lean back to watch the spectacle. The stars above twinkle faintly as though amused by the human insistence on importing winter into summer. Your body relaxes, the music rocks you, and for a moment you're floating between centuries cradled by sound and sweetness. But just as your eyes close, you overhear something else: two men arguing by the fountain. They aren't talking about fun or flavour. They're arguing whether sherbat is healthy at all. Some say it heals the overheated body, others swear it's dangerous for the stomach, and you realise that for every sip of delight there's always a physician ready to rain on the festival. Their debates earnest and a little absurd will carry you into the next story. The drums fade behind you, but the echo of debate clings to the air like smoke. You find yourself seated cross-legged on a worn carpet in the back of a scholar's courtyard. Lanterns sway from hooks, their glow catching the rims of brass cups filled with sherbat. Around you sit physicians, philosophers, and a few nosy neighbours who showed up for the free drinks. Tonight the topic is not poetry or politics, it's the medicine of cold drinks. The mainstream fact: Persian physicians, influenced by the humoral theory of Greek medicine, believed the body was governed by balances of hot, cold, dry and wet. Drinking sherbat, especially iced sherbat, could restore harmony, particularly in hot, dry climates, where tempers ran fiery. For fevers, sour cherry or pomegranate sherbat was prescribed to cool the blood. For heat stroke, a chilled rosewater syrup was said to bring balance back. Doctors recommended certain flavours for certain ailments, treating the drink less as dessert and more as prescription. But the quirky tidbit drifts in like a hiccup. Some doctors warned against drinking ice too quickly, claiming it could shock the stomach and cause weakness. One text even blamed an epidemic of summer stomachaches on excessive ice indulgence. You picture villagers sneaking sherbat at a festival only to be told afterward they had committed a medical sin. It's the ancient equivalent of being scolded for drinking too many slushies. Naturally, historians argue about how widely these medical views were practiced. Some suggest the ice cures were mostly elite luxuries. Ordinary villagers didn't get prescriptions for sherbat, they just drank water from clay jars. Others argue that humoral medicine filtered down, shaping folk remedies and daily habits across Persia. The evidence is scattered in manuscripts, some precise, some poetic, some so contradictory. You wonder if the physicians themselves were arguing more out of boredom than conviction. You sip your cup slowly, letting the rosewater cool your mouth. Around you, the courtyard hums with sensory anchors, the scratch of a reed pen on parchment, as a scholar jots notes. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing like a heartbeat through the alley, the faint tinkle of a bell tied to the scholar's old cat as it prowls lazily past. The night air carries a mix of scents: roasted nuts from a neighbour's pan mint, steeping in a jug, and that faint mineral tang of the clay jar. One physician makes a joke. If cold drinks were truly dangerous, the first man to eat snow would have died instantly. Yet here we sit, still arguing centuries later. The neighbours chuckle, and you catch yourself smiling too. There's something soothing about scholars fussing over sherbat as if it were life or death. Better that than fussing over swords or taxes. You lean back, letting the lantern light ripple in your cup. The sherbat is half melted now, the ice a memory, the sweetness muted. Your eyelids sag with the weight of sugar and philosophy. But before you can drift off, one scholar leans closer. He whispers that if you really want to understand the culture of chilled drinks, you must leave the doctors behind and follow the roads. Out there in the caravanserais, travellers and merchants sipped sherbat in ways the city never could. Their stories are humbler, dustier, and somehow even more refreshing. You stand leaving behind the courtyard debates of doctors and philosophers, and soon the city narrows into a dusty road lined with tamarisk trees. Before long you see the flicker of lanterns in the distance, and hear the restless bray of donkeys. A caravanserai rises out of the desert night, its walls square and solid, its arched gate yawning like a tired mouth. You step inside, and at once the air smells of sweat dust, and most importantly sherbat being ladled out for weary travellers. The mainstream fact caravanserais were essential resting stations along the silk and spice routes. Built roughly every 20 to 30 miles, the distance a caravan could travel in a day, they provided food, water, stables and beds, well beds meaning mats on the floor, and crucially they offered refreshment. Merchants and pilgrims could cool themselves with water drawn from underground cisterns, or when fortune allowed, flavoured sherbat cooled by ice from the yakhchals. It was at these way stations that recipes and flavours travelled as much as silks and spices, spreading traditions from one culture to another. Here's your quirky tidbit: some caravanserais had what were essentially sherbat menus. The innkeepers, eager to impress, offered travellers choices: rosewater, tamarind, quince, or even vinegar sherbat, which sounds strange, but on a hot day, that tangy sharpness could be divine. A tired pilgrim might grumble about his sore feet, then grin as he lifted a frosted cup that felt like a blessing. Imagine the medieval Yelp reviews. 3 stars bed, too hard, but sherbat excellent. And yes, historians argue again. Some believe ice was too rare to reach the majority of caravanserais, reserved only for larger cities along the main routes. Others counter that smaller way stations had clever methods of cooling clay jars hung in breezeways, or shallow night-freezing pools even in desert valleys. Whether every traveller got genuine ice sherbat or simply cool enough clay jar water remains a question. But either way, the tradition of refreshment at caravan stops was universal, and it kept both camels and humans from melting entirely. You settle onto a worn bench. Around you, the sensory anchors make the night vivid. A camel snorts outside its bell, clanging with tired irritation. A dog barks twice, then curls up by the gate. The soft sound of a ladle hitting a clay jug repeats like a metronome. Smoke from the kitchen fire drifts in laced with cardamom and grilled flatbread. A merchant beside you groans about the sand in his sandals, then sighs happily as he gulps a sherbat cooled just enough to feel miraculous. There's humour in this scene too. One traveller insists his sherbat is proof that the innkeeper has friends in heaven. Another complains that his cup is too small. If I'm walking across deserts, I want a sherbat the size of a camel's trough. You chuckle quietly into your cup, the coolness sliding down your throat, leaving you drowsy in the firelit courtyard. The night stretches longer. Merchants tell stories, pilgrims pray, and animals shift restlessly in their stalls. You almost fall asleep listening to the rhythm of clinking cups and bells. But before your eyes close, a poet seated under the arch begins to recite verses. His voice is calm, dreamy like water flowing over pebbles, and he sings not of war or kings, but of snow melting on lips. You realize the story of sherbat was not only written in recipes and architecture, it was woven into poetry, words cooling hearts as much as drinks cooled throats. The caravanserai fades into a hush, and you drift toward the sound of that poet's voice. His verses cling to the night air like lantern smoke rising and swirling, drawing you closer. You sit among travellers, merchants, and even a few sleepy camels, chewing, as though they understand every word. The poet tilts his head back, eyes half closed, and begins to chant lines that praise the desert's strangest luxury, ice, and sherbat turned into metaphors for love. The mainstream fact Persian poetry, especially during the classical periods of Hafez Sa'di and later poets, was rich with references to coldness and snow. These images weren't just decoration. Ice became a symbol of purity, sherbat, a metaphor for sweetness, rosewater for beauty, and snow melting on lips for fleeting passion. Poets used the rarity of cold drinks as emotional shorthand, just as ice was rare in the desert. So too was true love, true wisdom, or divine grace. When you hear a line about sherbat in a ghazal, you're meant to taste both the drink and the longing behind it. And then comes your quirky tidbit: one playful poet compared unrequited love to sherbat made without ice, sweet, but lukewarm, and therefore disappointing. Another described his rival's boasts as hot sherbat, a phrase that became a sarcastic jab among listeners. It was basically the medieval equivalent of calling someone's story all sizzle no steak. You can't help but chuckle softly imagining poets rolling their eyes at each other's metaphors while sipping from actual sherbet cups. Historians naturally debate how literally to take these verses. Did poets drink sherbat daily, or was it more symbolic than real? Some argue the constant references prove how woven into everyday life the drink had become. Others counter that the imagery was aspirational poets using ice and sherbat, the way modern writers use Ferraris and private jets, more fantasy than routine. The truth, as always, probably swirled somewhere in the middle. The sensory anchors lull you deeper. The poet's voice flows like water over polished stone. Bells from camel harnesses punctuate the pauses. Wind slithers through the courtyard arches, tugging at the edges of lantern flames. The air smells faintly of rosewater, charcoal, and wet clay. Each line of verse seems to drip slowly into your chest, soothing, rhythmic, hypnotic. You smile at the humour tucked inside the imagery. The poet pauses to sip, smacks his lips, and remarks that true sherbat should be colder than a miser's handshake. The crowd chuckles, even the tired guards at the gate. Someone mutters that poetry and sherbat are the only things that keep the desert bearable. You nod, eyes heavy, thinking they may be right. Your cup is empty now, just a ring of rosewater clinging to the rim. You place it on the mat, lean back against a stone pillar, and let the verses wash over you. But before you can drift into a nap, another voice interrupts, a storyteller this time, not a poet. He leans forward, eyes gleaming, and begins to whisper about how sherbat wasn't just poetry or pleasure. It was also politics wielded as power poured into cups that meant far more than refreshment. You lean toward the storyteller, his face lit by the unsteady glow of an oil lamp. The poet's verses still hang in the air like perfume, but this man's words slice through the sweetness. He tells you plainly sherbat wasn't just a drink. In the Persian courts, sherbat was politics served cold. The mainstream fact in royal banquets, sherbat was often reserved for the elite. The ability to serve ice-chilled drinks in the middle of summer wasn't simply a matter of taste, it was a display of power. To sip cold rosewater in July was to announce that your wealth could bend the desert to its knees. Rulers offered sherbat to honoured guests as a sign of favour, and sometimes withheld it from others as a silent insult. A cool drink could elevate or diminish reward or humiliate all without a single word being spoken. Here's your quirky tidbit: some chronicles claim sherbat was even used as a diplomatic bargaining chip. An envoy arriving from a rival kingdom might be welcomed with sherbat sweetened by saffron, an extravagant gesture. But if that same envoy was given only warm water, the message was equally clear: you're not worth the ice. One amusing anecdote describes a guest boasting about the sherbat he was served at court, only to have a rival mock him later. Ah, but was it the first ice from the mountain or the scraps from the bottom of the pit? Even refreshment had a pecking order. Naturally, historians debate the extent of this symbolic role. Some argue we overread the sources that sherbat was mostly practical refreshment, and its political role exaggerated. Others counter that in a land where ice itself was a miracle, every cube carried weight. Who could drink what, when and where mattered just as much as the colour of robes or the placement of seats at a feast. The argument continues sometimes with more heat than the topic deserves. You smile, imagining academics sweating in summer libraries while writing furious footnotes about chilled drinks. The sensory anchors deepen. The lamp sputters softly, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Outside, the desert wind combs through tamarisk trees, making them rustle like paper scrolls. A distant donkey bell punctuates the storyteller's pauses, and once in a while laughter drifts in from the road beyond the caravanserai. The night smells of smoke dust and the faint tang of vinegar sherbat someone left unfinished. There's humour even here. One guard listening in mutters, "If sherbat was politics, I'd have been king long ago. I never leave my cup empty." Another adds, "Then again, kings can't enjoy it." too busy worrying whether someone poisoned the ice. The group chuckles darkly, and you can't help but smile, realizing how refreshment could become burden in the wrong cup. You tilt your head back, staring at the stars through the courtyard's open roof. The idea of sherbat as political theatre makes you drowsy but curious. If ice could crown kings and humiliate rivals, what about the people who actually fetched it, the harvesters high in the mountains, cutting slabs before dawn? Surely their story holds as much chill as any palace intrigue. The storyteller nods knowingly as though he read your thoughts and says softly, "Then follow me to the peaks where the snow harvesters rise before the sun." The courtyard fades and suddenly you're trudging up a mountain path before dawn. The desert is far behind you now, replaced by rocky slopes that bite into your sandals. Your breath fogs in the chill air and the wind hums low like a monk chanting. Ahead, silhouettes bend with tools across their shoulders, the snow harvesters, men and boys who climb the peaks to cut and carry winter's skin before the sun steals it away. The mainstream fact in parts of Persia, teams were dispatched into the mountains each winter to gather snow or ice. They packed it tightly into straw, loaded it onto mules or camels, and sent it down toward yakhchals and city markets. The work was grueling, often beginning in darkness when the snow was firm and the air still forgiving. Without these harvests, the ice houses would stand empty by midsummer. The entire system depended on men who carved cold out of the mountains like stone from a quarry. Your quirky tidbit: some accounts mention that snow harvesters sang rhythmic chants while cutting blocks, partly to coordinate their efforts, partly to stay awake in the freezing dawn. Imagine a dozen men hacking ice with crude saws, their voices echoing off cliffs as though the mountain itself were joining in. There are even jokes about how young apprentices would slip snowballs down each other's collars, proving that even in the harshest labour, mischief has a seat at the table. Historians, of course, argue over scale. Some insist these operations were widespread, institutionalised, feeding the needs of entire cities. Others think they were more sporadic, organised by wealthy patrons or officials for special occasions. The evidence is patchy travellers' notes, a few fiscal records, some scraps of poetry that praise the men who bring summer its snow. Still, the image is striking a society so determined to sip cold sherbat in July that it trained men to carve frost from January's bones. The sensory anchors keep you grounded on the slope. Your sandals crunch against hard snow. The iron of a pickaxe rings sharply, echoing like a bell struck in a frozen cathedral. The wind whistles between rocks, carrying with it the faint scent of pine resin and cold stone. A mule snorts nearby, its breath pluming white against the dawn. Each sound is sharper here, cleaner, as if the mountain itself has been scrubbed with ice. There's humour in this frozen labour. One harvester mutters that the snow doesn't pay enough to freeze his toes off, while another replies that at least he gets to throw snowballs in the boss's direction when no one's looking. Someone jokes that their wives think they're noble providers, but really they're just cold, wet and grumpy. The laughter steams into the air, brief but genuine, before the men bend back to their work. You crouch, scoop a handful of powder and feel it numb your fingers instantly. It's absurd you were sweating in the desert hours ago and now your hand aches from winter. You shake your head, amazed at how people have bent landscapes into cooperation, convincing two opposite seasons to hold hands. But before you can drift into the rhythm of saws and chants, the foreman calls the group to attention. The blocks must be packed and moved quickly before the sun climbs too high. Straw-rope mule and muscle all must work in harmony. And this urgency, this seasonal ritual, carries forward into the next story, the careful rhythm of storage where winter labour becomes summer luxury. The sun begins to edge over the mountain ridge, and with it the urgency sharpens. You follow the harvesters as they lash their blocks of ice with ropes, each slab glowing faintly in the first light like glass borrowed from the sky. The mules grunt, shifting under the new weight, and the procession winds downward into valleys where desert waits to reclaim the load. What began as a frosty dawn on a mountain now becomes a long, dusty march into summer. The mainstream fact: this wasn't a one-time stunt. The seasonal rhythm of ice storage was a cornerstone of Persian ingenuity. During winter, teams cut and packed ice into yakhchals, layering it with straw to insulate. In some towns, shallow canals or freezing pools were engineered specifically to maximize nightly ice formation. Winter labour meant summer refreshment. It was a cycle as dependable as planting and harvest. Every block of ice represented not just coldness, but foresight, patience, and community effort. The quirky tidbit: in some villages, people threw festive ice gatherings during the harvest, celebrating the work as if it were a crop. Children were allowed to play on the frozen pools before the cutting began, skating clumsily, or sliding until their bottoms hurt while elders scolded half-heartedly. There are even tales of couples courting among the snow mounds, carving hearts into the blocks before they were hauled away. Imagine leaving your initials in a cube of ice that later ends up in a king's sherbat glass. That's what you'd call cold romance. Naturally, historians debate how effective the insulation was. Could straw and clay really hold ice for months? Some argue that the genius of yakhchals made it possible, combining shade airflow and thick sarouge walls to keep even July's heat at bay. Others remain sceptical, suggesting that much of the ice melted, and what remained was carefully rationed for the elite. Archaeology gives us the domes and pits, but not the exact volume of ice preserved, so the debate slides on like melting snow under a noonday sun. The sensory anchors embrace you. Straw rustles as it's stuffed between ice blocks, dry and scratchy against your ears. The mules' bells clink in uneven rhythm as they plod. The smell is a curious blend pine resin from the mountain's dust, rising from the trail, and the faint metallic tang of snow melting against rope. Each step downward feels like crossing seasons with your own feet. Humour walks with the caravan too. One mule refuses to budge, earning curses and laughter from the men who joke that he's protesting climate change centuries early. Another harvester insists he can carry a block on his own shoulders, staggers 2 steps, then collapses in mock exhaustion while the others roar with amusement. You smile with them, realizing that even in grueling labour, people find ways to make the mountain a stage for comedy. By the time you reach the outskirts of town, your arms ache from imagined lifting, and your lips taste of salt and cold. The blocks disappear into the yakhchal's wide mouth, swallowed by straw and silence. The harvesters lean on their tools, exhausted, while the foreman scratches his beard and mutters about rationing schedules. Because this is only half the story. The real test is not cutting or carrying, it's managing the treasure for months to come, ensuring that July's sherbat still carries the breath of January. And with that thought, you descend into the hidden discipline of ice storage itself. The bustle of unloading fades, and you find yourself standing at the rim of a yawning pit beneath the yakhchal dome. The harvesters have gone home to thaw their fingers by small fires, but inside this chamber the work continues. Here, under shadows that smell faintly of clay and straw, the seasonal rhythm of ice storage becomes its own ritual, as meticulous as prayer. The mainstream fact: the Persians didn't simply dump ice into pits and hope for the best. They carefully stacked blocks in alternating layers, each separated by straw or reeds, to slow the melt and allow airflow. Meltwater was sometimes channeled into reservoirs for reuse. The dome above wasn't just a lid, it was a thermal shield thick enough to deflect summer sun and curved to circulate cooler air inside. Rationing was strict. The icekeeper measured out blocks across the months, ensuring that even the hottest weeks still offered the shock of cold in sherbat or medicine. It was survival through mathematics, patience carved into architecture. The quirky tidbit in some towns' records suggests that chunks of ice were marked with charcoal symbols or clay tags indicating which families had rights to them. Imagine little logos scrawled on the surface. This block belongs to the merchant with the bushy moustache. One tale even claims a bride's dowry was partly negotiated and access to summer ice an inheritance of cold comfort. You can't help but grin at the thought of someone bragging, "My daughter comes with 3 carpets, 2 donkeys, and half a pit of January snow." Historians argue naturally about how egalitarian this storage was. Did ordinary households really get access, or was the lion's share swallowed by nobility and merchants? Some evidence points to communal use with villagers, pooling labour and sharing the cold. Other sources imply tight elite control ice distributed like coin to curry favour. The scholarly tug-of-war continues, though. The yakhchal walls remain silent, keeping their secrets, as well as they kept the snow. You crouch by the straw, pressing your palm against a block. The ice is firm, numbing, whispering of the mountain mornings, while the desert outside gasps under a sun that feels like molten brass. Drips echo softly in the chamber, each one a metronome of melt and endurance. Above the dome breathes faint draughts, carrying away warmth like a sigh. The sensory anchors sink into your bones, the dry rustle of straw, the hollow plunk of water dripping into a clay channel, the muffled shuffle of sandals as the keeper checks his tally. Outside, the desert wind moans faintly, but here the world is wrapped in quiet insulation. Even your own breath feels cooler, like you've borrowed lungs from the mountain. A keeper cracks a joke as he chalks a symbol onto a block. "This one is mine, unless I die first, then it's my nephew's." Another chuckles, saying the blocks should come with receipts. though good luck finding parchment that doesn't sweat ink in this humidity. You laugh softly too, realizing you're sitting in a medieval ice bank, and the jokes about ownership sound suspiciously modern. Your eyelids grow heavy as you watch the drip, drip, drip. Each drop feels like a tiny clock tick counting down to midsummer. But before you nod off, the keeper taps your shoulder and whispers that this ice is not only for local thirst. Merchants carry tales of it beyond Persia, bragging in distant markets of snow that survived the desert crossing, and that he says is where the story melts into legend when ice itself becomes an export, a rumour, a marvel told in caravans far from home. You lean back against the cool clay wall of the yakhchal, the straw rustling softly under your shoulder, and the keeper's words still echo in your ear. Ice was not only for locals. That whisper carries you out of the pit across the courtyard and into the caravan roads where stories travel faster than camels and twice as stubborn. Because once the Persians had mastered the art of coaxing January to live in July, they didn't keep quiet about it. No merchants bragged loudly, shamelessly, and endlessly, turning blocks of snow into legends that melted across markets from Baghdad to Delhi. The mainstream fact Persian merchants often carried not only spices, textiles, and ceramics, but also tales of their homeland's cooling marvels. In markets across the Middle East and Central Asia, they boasted of sherbat served with mountain snow in summer of domes that stored ice for months of wind catchers that bent the breeze into submission. Ice itself wasn't always exported physically, though small shipments of snow did occasionally reach distant courts. But the idea of Persian cold became an export in its own right. It was part advertisement, part propaganda, part myth-making, and in trade a good story was worth nearly as much as the goods themselves. Here's the quirky tidbit: some merchants claimed that Persian ice was so pure it never melted, a clear exaggeration, but one that turned heads. Imagine a trader in an Indian bazaar proclaiming, "Our snow survives the desert untouched," while his audience, sweating under the monsoon sun, gawked in disbelief. Others bragged that sherbat from Isfahan could cool even the anger of a tyrant. One even spun a tale of ice blocks so large that servants had to chip them down like stone. Were these sales pitches or folk legends? Probably both, but they stuck in people's minds like saffron stains on linen. Naturally, historians weigh in, their quills scratching like restless insects. Some argue these tales reveal a deliberate Persian branding strategy. Cold as Persia became a slogan of sorts, enhancing the empire's prestige along the trade routes. Others think the stories were exaggerations by individual merchants meant to dazzle customers and justify higher prices for sherbat syrups or rosewater. Without shipping invoices for 4 camels of snow packed in straw, it's hard to know which side is right. But the debate itself shows how cooling technology leapt beyond survival. It became a kind of cultural export. The sensory anchors drift through the imagined market scene. The clang of copper scales measuring spices. The flap of awnings as desert wind tries to tear them loose. The rhythmic thwack of a pestle crushing cardamom pods, releasing a sharp fragrance that cuts through the heat. A donkey bell jangles unevenly while a merchant's voice soars above the din, promising marvels that sound almost magical. Snow in July, cold drinks under the desert sun. The air smells of cumin, sweat, dust and rosewater all tangled together. There's humour here too. Picture a rival merchant rolling his eyes, muttering, "Snow that never melts. What's next? Fish that walk." Or imagine a customer buying rose syrup convinced it will taste colder because it came from Persia, only to find it just as warm as anywhere else. You chuckle softly, realizing that marketing exaggeration has been part of human trade for as long as markets have existed. Ice was simply the ancient world's version of new and improved. You lean against a stall, letting the chatter wash over you. One boy tugs at his father's sleeve, begging to hear the story of sherbat fountains again, while another merchant loudly insists he once drank sherbat cooled with snow carried all the way from Mount Damavand. True or false, the story crackles with life travelling further than the snow itself ever could. Your eyelids droop as the market hum becomes a lullaby, bells, voices, awnings, flapping like sails. But before you slip into sleep, another story catches your ear, an older one whispered at the edge of the crowd. It's about a conqueror, a banquet, and ice hauled across impossible distances. Alexander the Great, they say, once demanded cold in the heart of summer. Was it history legend or just another merchant's tall tale? The only way to find out is to follow the rumour to its source. You follow that whispered rumour through the market's haze until you find yourself in a different century, seated beneath a tent so large it seems stitched from the sky itself. torches hiss against the desert wind, soldiers polish bronze that gleams like fire, and servants rush about with trays balanced precariously. This is no caravanserai, no Persian court, no village feast. This is the camp of Alexander the Great, the man whose appetite for conquest was only rivaled, it seems, by his appetite for cold wine in hot places. The mainstream fact ancient sources, some reliable, some more theatrical than factual, tell us that Alexander, during his campaigns through Persia and beyond, demanded snow or ice to be fetched from mountains and carried down to chill his wine. His armies marched in brutal heat, dust and exhaustion, choking every breath, yet at the heart of the camp, the general sipped wine that steamed with coldness. For him, luxury wasn't merely comfort. It was a symbol of control. To drink ice in the desert was to show that even nature itself bowed to his command. It was political theatre poured into a goblet. The quirky tidbit arrives with a splash of wine. One tale insists Alexander punished a servant for bringing him warm water, scolding that if the Persians could drink sherbat chilled with snow, then surely the greatest conqueror alive deserved better. Another story claims soldiers grumbled that while they marched half dead under the sun, their leader was sipping iced drinks like a pampered noble. You can almost hear the mutters in the ranks. He conquers the world, but can't conquer thirst without snow. It's the ancient equivalent of a boss with air conditioning in his office, while everyone else sweats outside. Historians, as always, are split. Some argue Alexander's icy banquets are exaggerated stories inflated by later writers eager to romanticize his charisma. Others insist there is truth in the accounts pointing to Persia's established systems of ice collection and storage which his armies likely encountered and adapted. Did he really sip snow-cooled wine every night? Probably not. But did he make sure that at least for ceremonial banquets the impossible luxury of ice was displayed? Almost certainly. History often lives between exaggeration and practicality, and Alexander excelled at both. The sensory anchors take hold around you. The desert wind presses against the tent walls, making them billow like sails on a restless sea. A bronze bell dangles at the entrance, jingling faintly whenever a servant passes through. The air smells of sweat leather and the sharp tang of resinous torches, and when a servant pours wine into your cup, the faint hiss of melting snow is audible, the sound of winter collapsing into summer in a single drop. Humour lingers even here. One soldier near you, clutching a chipped mug, mutters that his wine tastes more of dust than grapes, and if Alexander doesn't share his snow, the men might storm the ice pit before they storm the next city. Another jokes that the conqueror's true legacy isn't empire, it's teaching humanity to expect cold drinks at dinner. You chuckle quietly, picturing the irony of history's greatest general remembered as the inventor of the cocktail hour. You sip and the cold sears your teeth. It's shocking alive like lightning disguised as wine. For a moment you almost believe Alexander's myth that he had conquered not just nations but the seasons themselves. But myths travel far, and as you lean back against the cushion, you realize his banquet is just one thread in a larger tapestry. Because beyond generals and kings, the Persians themselves created oases where cold lived year-round, not just in cups of wine, but in entire gardens cooled by hidden water. And those gardens too await your wandering steps. You step out of the conqueror's tent and into a hush that feels almost impossible after drums, torches, and bragging. The world narrows to shade and water, two words the desert rarely says in the same sentence. You're in a Persian garden drawn on the earth like a geometric dream, straight paths crossing like threads on a loom, narrow rills of water sliding through channels of stone, cypresses standing at attention, pomegranate trees stooping under their lantern fruit. You walk slowly because this place is designed to make you slow down, to cool you not only in skin but in thought. A dove coos from a branch. Somewhere a tiny runnel clicks over a lip of carved stone with the sound of a glass bead ticking on wood. Even the air here feels taught to behave, passing over water and leaf before it reaches your face as if it's learned manners from the gardener. The mainstream fact you're standing in a chahar bag, the four-part garden, that Persia made famous quadrants divided by channels, all fed by the quiet genius of qanats, karis, those underground aqueducts that pull mountain water by gravity across impossible distances. The channels aren't simply decorative, they're climate machines. Shallow water spreads heat across a broad surface, trading it for evaporation. Shade trees lower the radiant load. Smooth stone keeps the day's scorch at bay, and breathes back coolness at night. In richer estates and pavilions, water is coaxed up through discreet vents, gliding into salsable cascades, low-ribbed stairways of stone or tile, that break a stream into thin sheets, maximising its skin, maximising its breath-turning liquid into a soft breeze that you can taste. Gardens like these didn't just please kings, they made summers bearable. Later their geometry wandered east, with conquerors and poets reappearing in Mughal pleasure gardens, where the same fourfold plan cradled water like a crown jewel. A quirky tidbit pads out of the shade on quiet feet at night. Gardeners sometimes stretched reed matting across the channels, and hung wet cloth along colonnades so the passing air would go away cooler and come back nicer. In a few estates, attendants floated thin clay bowls across the rills like tiny moons, each holding a pinch of oud or frankincense that perfumed the air as it drifted. There are even stories equal parts pride and mischief of boys, slipping slivers of ice from the yakhchal into the salsabal on Nowruz, just to watch steam of astonishment rise from guests' mouths as water ran cold in the hottest hour. If Instagram had been around, there'd be 1,000 sunset videos titled "When the Garden Exhaled." Naturally, historians argue about just how effective this cooling really was. Some scholars insist that Persian gardens created measurable microclimates, shaving many degrees off the day's heat and raising nighttime humidity enough to coax delicate plants into comfort, a triumph of passive design. Others say that much of the cooling was sensory theatre shade, sound, scent and suggestion, doing half the work inside your brain with only modest drops on a thermometer. They debate the spread of salsable features, were they common elements, or urban luxuries celebrated in poetry because they were rare. The evidence is part ruins, part texts, part stubborn air, the kind that refuses to hold a number long enough for anyone to measure it. You sip from an imagined cup and think whether the garden cooled 5 degrees or 15, your body doesn't care. It believes, and belief is half the miracle. The sensory anchors arrive like courtiers. Wind comes first, braided with the faint splash of water and the green hush of leaves rubbing together. Bell second, a tiny one tied to a gardener's keyring, chiming whenever he stoops to test a valve. Then scents crushed mint along a path, jasmine blooming like a polite confession, and the mineral smell of damp stone. Far away a gate opens and closes with a wooden sigh. A dragonfly skims the channel, its wings tick like paper fans. You lean over the rill and let your fingers run through it, thin, cool, purposeful. The garden teaches your pulse a new tempo, unhurried, evenly spaced kind. A gardener spots you and grins the face of a man who knows how to trick noon into courtesy. He explains in that unhurried way of anyone who wins arguments, by pointing how the water arrives low and quiet from the qanat, how the grade of the channels is set to neither rush nor dawdle, how the trees are chosen for their shade geometry and their seasonal leaf habits. Cypress stays, he says, tapping a trunk. Pomegranate gives fruit and dapple, plane tree for wide hands of shade, date palm for height and whispering. He points to a tiled surface under a pavilion where the salsabal breaks a stream into lace. Touch there, he says, and then sit down. Your skin will thank the mathematician who measured that slope. You do? It does. A quiet laugh escapes you. A joke sidles in. The gardener winks and says the garden has 2 kinds of guests, those who ask, "Who paid for this?" and those who ask, "Where can I nap?" You raise your hand for the second. He laughs. Good, he says. The water likes sleepers. It cools them first. Another gardener complains that poets keep stealing adjectives from the flower bed, so the roses are angry, and may withhold their scent until somebody returns at least one metaphor by sundown. You promise to leave a simile on the bench when you go, but the garden isn't only shade and pretty arithmetic. It's also infrastructure, the visible tip of a hidden system. Beneath your feet, a qanat runs like a subterranean hymn, its mother well born in the mountain, its galleries stitched by hand with pick and patience. At intervals, vertical shafts vent air and give diggers a way back to daylight. The water rises in the estate through a discreet saghana, a delivery point, and what the garden doesn't sip glides onward to kitchens, baths, workshops. At the far edge, low channels loop past plant beds to give last sips to soil and return as grey water to orchards. In some villas, they say narrow vents from the qanat open into Badgia wind catchers, so air passing over the cool stream slips into rooms as if it has just met snow. Whether that elegant handshake of water and wind was universal or rare is another fight for the scholars, but the very rumour makes your scalp tingle. You wander under a pergola stitched with vine. Grapes hang like drowsy planets glossed with bloom. Along the path, tiles flicker in and out of shade, lapis turquoise white, patterned like small maps. You settle on a low platform where cushions are already thinking about naps. As you ease down, the stone exhales the last of its night cool into your back. The water beside you makes a sound like pages turning. You've never been more awake to the fact that calm is a kind of architecture. Another quirk the garden doubles as classroom. Children are taught the months by which leaf appears where. Servants learn how to balance flavour and air rosewater here, basil seed there. Stewards memorise the rations of the ice house to know which feast gets shaved snow and which gets honest cool water. On festival days, kites skate the garden sky. On legal days, agreements are signed in the pavilion because no one starts a quarrel when the salsabol is making lace of the afternoon. A notary grins that his ink never dries too fast here and his temper never dries at all. The debate resumes at the edge of your nap. A visiting architect claims these gardens are the ancestor of 1,000 later places, Mughal charbags, Andalusian patios, even European follies that try to imitate Persian calm. Another insists the borrowing went both ways, that forms travelled like caravans reshaped at each stop, until no one can claim a pure lineage. You shrug politely. You're a guest of the trees and think water doesn't care whose idea the channel was. It only wants the grade to be right. The afternoon leans toward evening, shadows stitched together. The air loses a degree as if the garden has quietly paid you a coin. You close your eyes and hear over the small music of water a faint thrum above the wall. Something taller catching the breeze, something architectural that hunts wind and brings it home. You open your eyes and see them on the skyline beyond the cypresses, tall badger wind catchers like upright oars against the sky, their mouths turned toward the moving air. You think of rooms cooled without a single machine of towers that swallow summer and breathe back night. You rise reluctant as the garden folds the day into itself. Your sandals know the path now. Your pulse speaks the language of rills. The gate waits in a wash of late light. The breeze touches your cheek, newly mannered by water and leaf, and then drifts onward toward those towers that made a science of wind, and in doing so whispered to later civilizations that heat can be taught grace. But the next lesson was even stranger when buildings learned to catch the wind like ships, and whole cities listened for the cool it carried. You lift your eyes from the quiet geometry of the garden and find your gaze caught by towers rising in the distance, badger the wind catchers, tall and solemn as watchmen who never blink. They stand above roofs like the ribs of ships pointed to the sky, mouths yawning toward the breeze. And when the wind blows, these towers drink it in swallow heat and breathe back something gentler. You walk toward them curious until their shadows stretch across your sandals like cool invitations. The mainstream fact Persian architects perfected the use of badger tall wind towers, designed to funnel breezes downward into homes, mosques and palaces. Their shapes varied square, octagonal or even circular, and each was oriented to catch prevailing winds. Inside, vertical shafts guided air downward. Sometimes the towers were connected to underground channels or qanats, so the wind passed over cool water before entering living spaces, dropping the temperature dramatically. It was passive air conditioning centuries before the first humming machine. In Yazd and other desert cities, whole skylines once bristled with these towers, creating microclimates where human breath could slow and nights could finally stretch into sleep. Here's your quirky tidbit: some wind catchers were even built double-sided, able to both draw in fresh breezes and expel warm air depending on the season. Imagine a medieval HVAC system that required no electricity, just clever geometry and a respectful conversation with the atmosphere. Travellers from cooler lands often gaped at these towers, writing in their diaries that Persians had tamed the wind. A few even joked that the towers made the desert itself polite. And yes, children sometimes climbed halfway up the vents to shout down them, turning the house below into an accidental megaphone. Historians as always debate their reach. Some claim wind catchers were ubiquitous, built into even modest homes, part of the shared knowledge of survival. Others argue they were mostly elite architecture, expensive to build and maintain, and more common in cities than villages. Excavated remains are uneven, records are partial, and so the argument drifts on like the very breezes these towers once caught. Still, the consensus is clear enough: wherever they rose, they changed the rhythm of life, proving that desert air could be coaxed, filtered, softened. The sensory anchors guide you upward. You hear the low moan of wind inside the shaft, like a flute being played by the invisible. Somewhere a bell tied to a mule outside clinks lazily, the sound carried strangely through the tower, echoing inside your ears. The air smells faintly of damp clay, for the tower has drawn it across a hidden pool. When you touch the wall, it feels cooler than your skin, as though the structure itself has remembered winter. Humour lingers here too. A local chuckles that some men build taller wind catchers not for comfort but for bragging rights. The higher the tower, the cooler the ego. Another says the towers are like nosy relatives always sticking their heads into your business. You laugh softly, the breeze tickling your hair as if agreeing with the joke. You lean against the tower's base eyelids, heavy as the cooled air flows gently around you. It's more than refreshment, it's an embrace, silent and steady. But before your drowsiness wins, your guide nudges you. These towers, he whispers, were not the end of the story. Their designs wandered eastward, westward, quietly shaping other worlds. Later civilizations borrowed and bent them each in their own way. You'll see the echoes if you listen carefully. The air shifts again, carrying you forward into the legacy these towers left behind, a story of influence and inheritance, whispered across centuries and continents. You leave the skyline of wind catchers behind and step into the quieter lanes where habit is stronger than architecture, where people cool life not only with domes and towers, but with rituals so ordinary they've become invisible. Here the desert's lessons have been tucked into manners, meal times, blessings and jokes. Here survival wisdom wears the clothes of custom. You move through a doorway, and a woman presses a clay cup into your hand without asking your name. You already know the rule: first water, preferably cool, then conversation, then anything else. In this part of the world, no one lets your throat do the talking for you. The mainstream fact in Persia and across Iranian cultures, hospitality took on the physics of climate. Cooling wasn't only a technology, it was an ethic. Clay jugs in doorways, sherbat at gatherings, shade offered with the same urgency as chairs. These habits became a survival code disguised as kindness. Festivals centered on water and coolness were not rare embellishments. They were seasonal reset buttons. Think of Nowruz, the new year at spring's edge, with bowls of water on the haft-seen table, sometimes a tiny goldfish darting like a living comma, or Tirgan, a celebration tied to water and rain, when sprinkling each other becomes a game and a prayer. Even in everyday life, households learn to sweeten the heat with sekanjabin, a vinegar and mint syrup mixed with water, a remedy equal parts refreshment and folk medicine. Cooling the body meant cooling the mood. Cooling the mood meant preserving family peace. The climate taught etiquette, and etiquette taught endurance. A quirky tidbit toddles in on little feet at some weddings. The first drink shared by the couple could be a sherbat blessed by elders, the glass clinking softly as if to say, "May your summers be kind." In a few towns, families stored their syrups in small glazed amphorae, carefully labelled in neat script rose sour cherry quince, and woe to the uncle who put his moustache into the wrong jar. There are delightful stories of kids sneaking basil seeds, those slippery pearls just to watch them swell in a guest's drink, giggling as adults fished for them with spoons like tiny fishermen on a porcelain lake. Cooling became play. Play remembered the lesson better than sermons could. Naturally, historians argue about how much of this we should call ritual, and how much is simply good sense. Some scholars frame water sharing and doorway jugs as embedded religious virtues, hospitality, as a moral obligation, under both ancient Zoroastrian ideas of purity water as sacred and later Islamic teachings on charity and quenching a traveller's thirst. Others caution that we risk over-reading theology into ordinary practicalities. When the sun is a tyrant, you don't need canon law to justify a jug by the door. They go back and forth as scholars do over poems, court records and household manuals. Were Shabbat rites formally codified, or did they just calcify naturally like limescale on a beloved kettle? The answer, like most honest answers, seems to be both. You drift into a courtyard where late afternoon has softened the edges of everything. The soundscape changes, not wind or bells now, but water, murmuring like very small waves in a broad ceramic bowl, as children float flower petals across it, sending tiny wakes that bump the rim. A grandmother snaps mint leaves between her fingers. The scent lifts green and cool, carrying the memory of mornings under vines. Near the doorway, a boy taps the lip of a brass tray. Ting ting, in a pattern he swears will make Shabbat taste colder. You smile. Rituals always include a little folklore, and folklore always includes a little performance. Etiquette arranges the scene. You're seated in shade, not asked to choose it. A tray arrives with cups already beaded in condensation from an unglazed jar. Someone adds a splash of sekanjabin. Someone else stirs with a long spoon until a tiny cold whirlpool forms. The host jokes that if the vinegar smells strong now, it will smell like victory after you walk home in the heat. You drink, and the first impression is bright and herbal, the second quietly sweet, the third a gentle cooling sigh that settles somewhere behind your eyes. Your shoulders drop a centimetre. The courtyard notices. Here's another small ritual before meals. A thin stream of water is poured over fingers into a shallow basin, practical yes, but also symbolic. Heat rises and kitchens tempers can too, and cool water on skin is a shared exhale. In some homes, the eldest offers the first cup to the youngest, an inversion that turns hierarchy into protection. In others, a guest receives the middle cup, the one judged just right by touch, because in a hot land, the perfect temperature is a hospitality superpower. You grin at the thought grandma as thermodynamics champion. There's humour everywhere it can fit. An uncle boasts that his sherbat is colder than the tax collector's heart, earning a chorus of groans. A cousin swears basil seeds can predict rain if they sink, quickly clouds are coming. If they float, you should quit asking silly questions and finish your drink. Someone claims you must stir counterclockwise to invite breezes into the courtyard. Someone else insists clockwise invites neighbours instead. You watch the spoon circles and think either way somebody's arriving. The mainstream threads return thicker. These acts of cooling also mark time. Dawn water for prayer. Midday sherbat for mercy. Evening tea cool enough not to fight the air for storytelling. During Ramadan, sunset brings cool drinks that are as much signal as sustenance. The day's heat passes from throat to sky in a single swallow, and the courtyard hum resumes. On Tirgan, children tie colour threads to their wrists, splash each other with water and chase shade like a prize. Later they drop the threads into a stream, sending their wishes along the coolest courier they know. Even the market rhythms nod to temperature syrup sellers, lift their bells. Small cheerful chimes right when the sun feels personal, drawing the thirsty like a Pied Piper with ice. A scholarly debate sharpens in the background. Did these customs originate in the great houses and trickle down, or were they vernacular, first later polished by courts and poets? Some point to manuals of courtly behaviour that choreograph sherbat service with the same rigour used for seating charts. Others point to village proverbs older than those books' proverbs that don't wait for permission to offer a cup. The archivists stack evidence like trays. The anthropologists watch hands move in kitchens and say, look there, that is the archive. You take another sip and decide both stacks matter paper remembers, but so do palms and lips, and the way a host watches your face after the first swallow. You wander to the threshold where the street's heat pushes back against the courtyard's calm. A boy refills the doorway jar, humming nothing in particular, and sprinkles a hint of rosewater across the surface, not to sweeten, just to signal. Passers-by recognise the smell as an invitation stop taste continue. An old man pauses, tips the ladle and sighs a thank you that sounds like a prayer and a joke at once. Hospitality becomes infrastructure, a public service rendered private and returned to the public again one clay molecule at a time. Another quirky stitch in the fabric in some neighbourhoods. Families took quiet pride in their ice allotments, not to flaunt them, but to share them an evening when a small shaved pile appeared in a dish in the lane, and spoons went around to children first. Laughter escalated. The cold vanished. The memory stayed. Elsewhere, an apothecary kept a tiny medical ration for the infirm doling it, with drama and scolding because drama makes medicine memorable. You can hear him now. 1 spoon for the fever, 2 spoons for the story you will tell about me later. The courtyard returns you to scent fresh-cut cucumbers clean as a river word. A lime nicked by a thumbnail. Wet earthenware breathing a mineral lullaby. Your pulse adopts the longer sentences of late afternoon, and for a suspended minute you feel like a cup yourself filled to the brim with not hurrying. Cooling as ritual has done its other job, it has slowed time, and when time slows, nerves cool too. The climate taught people to pace their kindness. A last small debate floats up like steam was the belief doing half the work. Did people actually feel cooler because Shabbat carried the story of mountains, because bowls of water echoed order and renewal, because shade and scent were arranged like grammar? Some scholars argue yes, placebo is still a place, and that the human body will follow a well-told instruction. Others insist the physics evaporation conduction airflow deserves the applause. You diplomat that you are clap for both for stone and story for straw and song. Evening tilts in, and the courtyard tips the day into blue. Someone lights a small lamp. Its reflection trembles in the water bowl like a second flame learning to swim. A child yawns. The host fills your cup one last time, light on syrup, now heavy on cool, and says, "Before you go, tell us if the world outside still bites." You drink and the bite feels blunted as if your throat has negotiated a truce with the air. You stand, thank the house, and step back to the lane. The desert is still the desert, warm, insistent, but a little less bossy for the moment. Behind you the doorway jar sighs a clay sigh. Ahead, a faint clink like ice in a modern glass tickles your ear, not memory, not legend, but the present day practicing old tricks with new machines. And that's where you're headed next, from ritual to refrigerator, from yakhchal to kitchen counter, from straw-wrapped snow to the cubes you hardly notice. But the next duty was even stranger when your cup here and now turns out to be the latest chapter in a very old cool story. You turn a last corner of the lane and with a blink step over centuries into your own kitchen. Familiar countertops, the faint hum you never notice a door. You open a dozen times a day without ceremony. The refrigerator light comes on with a tiny gasp and cold air brushes your face like a polite servant. You reach and clink a few cubes into a glass pour water and watch it fog with chill, as if the mountain has just leaned into your house to say hello. It's so ordinary that you almost miss it, the end of a long story that began with pits, domes, wind and stubborn hope in a thirsty land. The mainstream fact modern cooling is an unbroken thread of problem solving that owes a quiet debt to people who learn to shape climate with architecture. Your fridge turns compression and expansion into cold. The thermostat negotiates a truce between walls and weather. Urban planners talk again and again about passive cooling shade maps. Vented courtyards wind corridors as if they've rediscovered something new, when really they're writing footnotes to the yakhchal, the badger, the garden's rill. Energy-efficient buildings chase the same prize Persia courted with clay and straw. Calm air, patient water, and rooms that invite the body to slow down. Engineers now model evaporative towers for stadiums and night flush ventilation for schools. The diagrams look suspiciously like the bones of old ideas drawn with new pencils. Your quirky tidbit drifts in on a spoon order faluda in Tehran, or Shiraz, vermicelli. Thin rice noodles stirred into semi-frozen syrup perfumed with lime and rose, and you're eating the descendant of sherbat turned to silk. Ask for Bastani Sonati saffron ice cream, thickened with salep and bright with pistachio, and you'll hear the freezer hum. Yes, but you'll also taste the long echo of straw-packed snow mountain mornings folded into dessert. Even sekanjabin, the vinegar mint syrup you sipped in courtyards, shows up in summer picnics with cucumbers floating like tiny green boats on a cool lake. The names have travelled, the textures changed, but the instinct remains cool sweetness as a social language. Naturally, historians and architects argue about lineage. Some warn against romanticising a straight line from yakhchal to fridge, pointing out that mechanised cooling marked a rupture as dramatic as fire in a cave. Others insist material culture often spirals rather than breaks ideas recur, improved by tools revisited by necessity, especially now as cities heat and grids groan, and planners beg buildings to behave without gulping power. Was the old wisdom truly efficient at scale or mostly symbolic? Could a city of millions breathe comfortably on passive tricks alone? The debate is not academic anymore. It's a blueprint hunt, a search for ways to cool fairly without burning the future. You close the refrigerator and the soft hum settles back into your walls a domestic cricket. The sensory anchors align the delicate clink of ice cubes spinning in your glass, a neighbour's bicycle bell ringing on the street, the low ocean of traffic far away as steady and indifferent as a desert wind. Condensation pearls and runs, leaving trails like silver ink. You press the glass to your cheek, cool, immediate, obedient, and feel a chain of hands behind it. Harvesters in dawn, snowkeepers, counting blocks by lamplight, masons, smoothing sarouge engineers, plotting airflow with a string and a needle, gardeners grading salsable steps with a patient thumb. A million tiny negotiations with heat arrive condensed in your palm. You smile at the small absurdities that never quite leave this subject. A friend swears room temperature water hydrates better, so he stares at your ice like it's a moral failing. Another insists that unless a drink is colder than a tax collector's handshake, it isn't worth lifting the glass. Someone brings basil seeds to your barbecue and suddenly the children have turned your pitcher into a snow globe. You raise your eyebrows, you laugh, and then you pour again. The old jokes fit the new cups better than you'd expect. Pick up your phone and you can still hear the bells of the bazaar if you want to recipe videos for sharbati alu balu sour cherry syrups glinting like rubies. Slow tours of domed ice houses in Yazd, their interiors cool as vowels. Architects tracing wind paths over rooftops with smoke. A chef shedding saffron threads into cream the colour of sunrise. The comments are a global caravan Tehran to Toronto, Isfahan to Istanbul, Mashhad to Melbourne. Someone's grandmother swears you must stir counterclockwise. Someone's uncle says clockwise invites neighbours. You grin, apparently both directions still work. A few last facts hitch a ride in the closing light. City planners now map heat equity, placing trees and water features where streets hold sun like a grudge. Museums restore yakhchals with careful serruge to show how walls can be thick with intention. Experimental projects rig wind catchers over modern atriums. Office towers sip night air with the dignity of an old house. Passive strategies move again from footnote to first draft. The future is suddenly very old, and that's the most modern thing about it. You lift your glass. The ice cracks softly, a sound like a page turning. You take a slow sip and let the chill cross your tongue mountain, masquerading as kitchen, and your shoulders drop that now familiar centimetre. You've walked a long loop from bazaar bells to whispering domes, from straw to saffron, from festival fountains, to garden rills, from wind catchers, to your fridge's little loyal hum. The path is circular, the cool is cumulative. You keep sipping and feel the story settle into place as if your throat were shelving a book it has finally finished. And yet the last touch of the tale doesn't shout, it rests. Somewhere between the clink of your ice and the hush of your apartment, the old desert wisdom sets down its tools and leans against the wall. It nods at your glass, nods at your window, nods at the night. Yes, it says, that will do. But the next duty is even gentler, to let the story cool with you, to set your cup down and to follow the breeze into stillness. Let the room dim itself without trying. Pull the curtains just enough to soften the street's grammar, and let the air find its own sentence longer, slower, kinder. You set the glass down. The last bead of condensation slides toward the coaster, and stops as if it has decided it can rest here. In the quiet, the day loosens its belt and sits beside you. The hum of the refrigerator is not a machine now, but a low tide drifting in, drifting out, unhurried as breath. You can imagine the yakhchal some distance away, domed and patient, a winter kept in a clay syllable. You can imagine the windcatcher tasting the sky, the garden rill writing its thin blue line across stone, the ladle, dipping into a jar that sweats like honest work. Those places are not far. They're only a few degrees to the left of now. If you listen, you might hear a small bell or a reed tapping a glass rim, or sandals brushing dust into a softer pattern. The sounds do not call for you. They steady you. In your chest, something agrees to a slower pace. Shoulders sink, jaw unhooks, breath widens. Each inhale brings in a little mint, a little evening, a little truce. Each exhale sends out the heat you don't need to carry any longer. The room cools by exactly the amount you decide it can. A page turns somewhere and does not hurry to the next. When you're ready, let the last of the light fold itself into the corner. The story has set the glass on the table. The table has set the room on the night. The night has set a small unbroken path for your steps, and it is soft and it is yours, and there is nothing farther to fetch.